Good afternoon, and thank you again for being with us today. I'm Anne Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. We are delighted that you can be with us for what promises to be a fascinating presentation by Professor Sarah Guérin, who will speak to the development of trade networks linking medieval Europe and Western Africa in connection with the exhibition New Views of the Middle Ages, Highlights from the Wyvern Collection, expertly curated by Kate Geary, visiting assistant professor of art history at Bowdoin. Although the exhibition cannot yet be experienced in person by the public, we hope that you will take advantage of the outstanding electronic version of the exhibition that Professor Geary has developed and which is available through the museum's website. The Wyvern Collection, one of the world's most significant private collections of medieval art, brings together works from Africa, Asia, and Europe that shed light on the artistic developments and interconnected cultures of the Middle Ages. The related exhibition, which we look forward to sharing with the public as soon as we can safely do so, offers new insights into the medieval past and our connections to it. We are delighted that this exhibition, which is made possible by the generous long-term loan of highlights from the Wyvern Collection to the BCMA, has already inspired substantial original research, including among numerous students at Bowdoin, led by Professor Geary. Today's presentation helps further contextualize these objects, placing them within a rich intercultural history. During the course of Professor Guérin's remarks, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature. These will be visible to her and to our moderator, Professor Geary. And please also note that the live transcript function is available for captioning. And now, without further ado, let me turn to Kate Geary, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Kate?
Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for joining us today. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Sarah Guérin, Assistant Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses largely centered on medieval Europe. Before coming to Penn in 2016, Professor Guérin was a member of the faculty at the University of Montreal and held postdoctoral fellowships at Columbia University and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Through numerous publications, she has firmly established herself as one of the world's experts on medieval ivory carving, and importantly, the trade routes and cross-cultural connections that supported the creation of artistic works in ivory and other media in Europe, throughout the Mediterranean basin, and reaching across the Sahara into West Africa. Her object-centered approach to research allows her to examine surviving works of art in ivory and other materials as points of intersection for the complex and shifting socioeconomic, spiritual, and even ecological conditions that define the Middle Ages. Dr. Guérin has spoken here at Bowdoin before, delivering a paper in a symposium organized around the 2017 exhibition, The Ivory Mirror. Her focus on both the issues of materiality and cross-cultural interaction align closely, really almost perfectly, with many of the themes and works of art that make up two exhibitions currently running at the BCMA: New Views of the Middle Ages, Highlights from the Wyvern Collection, and The Presence of the Past, Art from Central and West Africa. I am thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Guérin back to Bowdoin to speak with us today about the development of trade networks linking medieval Europe and Western Africa, exploring the important roles played by these regions in the world systems that shaped the global Middle Ages. Her talk will shed light on the profound effects that these trade networks had on artistic production in both Africa and Europe. Before I turn the floor over to her, I would like to remind everyone that we are looking forward to your questions after the talk, and you can ask a question at any time during Dr. Guérin's talk or after using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And after she's finished, we'll pose as many questions as we have time for. So as time is short, let's move forward with today's presentation: Ivory, Copper, and the Island of Gold, Medieval Trade Between France and West Africa. Sarah?
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. And Goodyear and Elizabeth Humphrey have offered a very warm welcome. And I wanted to also thank the Wyvern collectors who for many years have offered warm encouragement of this topic and connected issues related to the global Middle Ages. Towards the beginning of the Roman de la Rose, Guillaume de Lorris describes the marvelous garden of love, where apple trees grow pomegranates, nut trees sprout nutmegs, and where almond, fig, and date trees flourish within the cloistered walls. These fruits of the Orient were joined by every imaginable spice, good for cleansing the palate after a meal: cloves, licorice, zedawari, anise, cinnamon, and an exotic new spice, grains of paradise, graines de paradis nouvelles. Written in the third decade of the 13th century, Guillaume's poem marks one of the first instances this peppery spice related to the ginger plant is recorded in Western Europe. Unlike locally available licorice and anise, or the cinnamon and zedawari, also known as white turmeric, imported from the Indian subcontinent, or the cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands of Indonesia, grains of paradise are native to the rainforests of West Africa and so came to Northern Europe by a completely different route. This long-distance relay network, which linked Guillaume de Lorris's France to the coastal rainforests of West Africa via Trans-Saharan routes, also resulted in the flourishing production of Gothic ivories during this exact same period. From about to 1230, diptychs, polyptychs, and statuettes made of African elephant ivory filled church treasuries and private chapels, while ivory boxes with courtly scenes and lavish toiletry sets adorned with flirtatious imagery were necessary fashions in aristocratic households. The prevalence of these two materials, elephant tusk and piquant spice, demonstrates a profound shift in the trade routes that provisioned European markets with artistic and culinary luxuries, and illustrates the central role that West Africa played in the medieval world system. Janet Abu Luhag shifted the concept of world system, coined by the sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein to discuss 20th century capitalism, applying it instead to the medieval globe. Abu Luhag demonstrated that a non-Occidental world economic network existed and thrived before the European-dominated system of the 16th century. Her schema consisted of 8 interlocking spheres, stretching from Western Europe and centered on the Champagne fairs, through the Mediterranean, multiple Islamic systems, and the Silk Roads all the way to the Far East. West Africa, however, sits forlorn and uncircumscribed on her diagram, and the Trans-Saharan trade that flourished, that furnished the Mediterranean basin and all of its interconnecting systems with the economic lubricant of gold is conspicuously absent. Despite Abu Luhag's oversight, Trans-Saharan gold caravans are well-known historic territory, due in part to contemporaneous texts furnished by Arabic-speaking geographers. However, these depictions of sub-Saharan Africa are cursory and generally bigoted, mitigating the economic and cultural systems that interlocked with the Saharan one at such important trading cities as Walata, Timbuktu, and Gao. Today, a richer picture of West African history and its economic system in the Middle Ages is still being drawn, largely by archaeologists. And much of this recent work is presented in the exhibition Caravans of Gold now in an online format at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, and also via an accessible platform developed by the project's chief curator, Kathleen Bickford-Brzok, at Northwestern's Block Museum of Art. In our time together today, I want to focus on 3 episodes in the history of medieval trade between West Africa and Western Europe. In the first, I present a snapshot of Trans-Saharan trade in the 13th and 14th centuries and introduce some of the commodities that traverse the desert, considering not only Mediterranean-bound cargo, the goods coming out of Africa, but the material needs and even desires of West African communities, what was imported. The second section focuses on artistic products from the ecological interface between the savannas of West Africa and the forest region, today in Nigeria, and reveals unexpected relationships between ivory, one of the key exports from West Africa, and copper alloys, a major commodity imported across the Sahara into West Africa, the West African economic sphere. The last section turns our attention to how knowledge of the Trans-Saharan system inflected major political decisions and artistic patronage in Western Europe, specifically in Capetian France in the last decade of Louis IX's celebrated reign, an investigation in which the fact that this saintly king died on African soil is taken seriously. So part 1, Trans-Saharan trade and its world of goods. One of the most detailed discussions of the mechanics of caravan trade across the Sahara is that of Ibn al-Khatib, writing in Granada in the mid-14th century. Abi Abd Ali Muhammad al-Makari of Tlemcen in modern Algeria had visited Granada in May of 1356, and Ibn al-Khatib recorded notes on the al-Makari family's trading network, which had been established on either side of the Sahara in the mid-13th century. Al-Makari's ancestors, according to what is stated in their biographies, became famous in trade. They established a desert route by digging wells and seeing to the security of merchants. The sons of Yahya were 5. They made a partnership by which all had equal shares in what they possessed or might possess. Abu Bakr and Muhammad were in Tlemcen. Abd al-Rahman, who is their elder brother, was in Sijilmassa. Abd al-Wahid and Ali, who were their 2 younger brothers, were in Walata. They, all of the brothers, acquired properties and houses in those regions, married wives, and begat children by concubines. The Tilmensani would send to the Sarari, those in the Sahara, that is Walata, the goods which the latter would indicate to him. The Sarari would send to him skins, ivory, nuts or jawaz, and gold. The Sijilmassi were like the tongue of a balance, indicating to them the extent of rise or fall in the markets and writing to them about the affairs of merchants and countries. And so their wealth expanded and their status grew. Walata is a small oasis town, now in the deserts of southeast Mauritania, that gained importance in Trans-Saharan trade just as the al-Makari family was consolidating their network in the mid-13th century. The 14th century historian al-Umari describes Walata as the farthest point of inhabited country after the grueling 1,500-kilometer trek across the desert from Sijilmassa. He further noted that the caravans leave Sijilmassa laden with salt, copper, and cowries, and returned with gold. He says they crossed the perilous deserts and risked dangers impelled only by great profits, which they make out of the Sudan, for they set out with valueless articles and return with bullion as their camel's burden. Ibn al-Khatib and al-Umari thus enumerate the standard commodities associated with medieval Trans-Saharan trade in both directions. Yellow gold came from the alluvial deposits in modern Senegal and Mali, along the Falemé and Niger rivers. Archaeologist Sam Nixon recently noted that after the intensification of Trans-Saharan trade in the 8th and 9th centuries, West Africa became the world's major gold supplier until the era of Columbus and the opening up of South American gold markets. The empires of Ghana from about the 7th century to 1100 and of Mali, which reigned from about 1250 to 1500, controlled the trade in gold from these sites, making these sub-Saharan polities fabulously wealthy. We will return to the siren call of sub-Saharan gold in the final section of this talk. White gold, that is elephant ivory, did not have a fixed place of origin, given the inherent mobility of its source, and it is particularly unstable across the medieval period due to climatic change. It was ivory of this African Savannah elephant that was prized across the Mediterranean world as the only species to produce large tusks so desirable for figural carving with solid diameters above 11 centimeters. Skins, both bovine hide for arms, the shields of oryx leather were coveted around the Mediterranean, as well as those of reptiles like crocodiles and carnivores, leopards and lions, were important prestige commodities. Al-Makari's mention of nuts or joies among the trade goods is one of the few instances when grains of paradise are named in the textual records of Trans-Saharan trade, demonstrating that the Al-Makari network had access to forest as well as savanna commodities. Among other goods, including likely ebony and indigo, there were undoubtedly enslaved peoples, whose traces are today notoriously difficult to follow in the archaeological record, but whose presence must not be forgotten. Although Al-Umari considered them valueless articles, salt, copper, and cowries imported into sub-Saharan Africa were essential to the health, physical, spiritual, as well as economic, of sub-Saharan communities. The importance of salt, especially in a hot climate, is incontrovertible, and there are few natural sources in West Africa. In fact, the paramount importance of this mineral might have provided the initial impetus for interregional, including trans-Saharan trade. The mines at Tagaza in Mali, the bed of an ancient salt lake, was a key source of both rock salt and the mineral fixative of alum, a chemical which was also increasingly important for Northern European textile industry. Tagaza is also, not coincidentally, the midpoint on the Sijilmassa-Walata route. Copper, sometimes called red gold, came from mines not only within the Sahara itself, but also from around the Mediterranean basin, and as we will see, from far beyond as well. Used in West Africa primarily for artistic and ritual purposes, locally available iron was preferred for weapons and tools. Copper and its alloys have recently been shown to have been valued for their spiritual malleability. In a number of sub-Saharan cultures, copper responds particularly well to the secret technologies of blacksmiths. Cowrie shells of a mollusk most prevalent in the Indian Ocean, and specifically those harvested in the Maldives, were used as currency in many parts of the Islamic world, including West Africa. Their passage to North Africa via the Red Sea and Egypt, and thence to West Africa by Trans-Saharan caravan, truly bespeaks West Africa's involvement in a world system. The trade of gold for cowries, moreover, could be considered as an exchange of monetary instruments between distinct value regimes, rather than Al-Umari's vision of an exploitative system in which mere trinkets are exchanged for pure bullion. To the salt, copper, and cowries traveling southwards across the Sahara should be added cloth, both luxurious silks and quotidian woolens, porcelains, glazed ceramics, and especially glass beads. At both ends of the route managed by the Al-Makari brothers, goods were funneled into the Mediterranean, or the medieval world system. The Mediterranean-oriented Tlemcen was connected with Europe and Asia, as far as the Indian Ocean and China. The same scope holds for Walata and other trade entrepôts on the southern shores of the Sahara, reaching deep into West Africa and Central Africa. The goods exchanged in these Sahelian centers originated across West Africa, from modern Senegal and Sierra Leone to modern Nigeria and Niger. The organization of intracontinental trade across these regions in the 13th and 14th centuries, therefore, most assuredly constitutes an important lobe of the world system. So part 2, the Savannah Forest Interface, Ivory for Copper. The caravan trade ended in the Sahel, the so-called southern shores of the Sahara, at Walata, as we have seen, as well as at the major entrepôts along the Niger River, including Gao, Tiraka, and later Timbuktu. This is important as the Niger River served as a through line across West Africa, connecting various climatic and ecological zones from the central savannas to the edge of the Sahara along the Niger River bend, to the forest regions of the Niger Delta, where it empties out into the Gulf of Guinea. The Niger River facilitated trade, although of course much movement of goods and people occurred along many other axes across the region. But for our purposes, the clear connection in terms of trade and mobility visualized by the river turns our attention to the forest regions of modern Nigeria. Archaeological finds illustrate how the kingdoms and polities throughout this region, such as Ife and later Oyo and Benin, were similarly actively engaged in long-distance trade. Works of art from Derby Takashe and Tata, sites in Nigeria from the Savannah and Savannah Forest interface respectively, emphasize the astonishingly wide compass of these communities' integration into the medieval world system. A cluster of 8 burial mounds at Derby Takashe in the savannas of northern Nigeria illustrate the reach of Trans-Saharan trading networks in the 14th century. 3 of these were high-status tombs, replete with the goods closely associated with Trans-Saharan trade. Metalwork from the Central Islamic lands, glass beads from an impressive number of far-ranging locales, cowrie seeds from the Indian Ocean, copper alloy bracelets and anklets, and a number of solid pieces of gold jewelry. Large ivory bangles were found in all 3 of the high-status graves, fashioned from the tusk of Savannah elephants roaming nearby. The tombs of Derby Takashe thus picture for us a community in direct contact with elephant populations, the source for trade routes that span some 4,000 kilometers to the ivory carving workshops of France, and they demonstrate how export goods were indeed appreciated locally. A wide variety of copper alloy objects found in the Derby Takashe tombs included finished imported goods, items cast locally, and the raw material itself in the form of ingots, the long, slim rods appropriate for trade. 3 brass ingots were found with the male individual from tomb 5, and in form, they are surprisingly close to those in the abandoned shipment of around 2,085 brass bars, which Stedhoff Monod found in 1964, together with thousands of cowrie shells in the so-called El Juf, or empty quarter of northern Mauritania, a site called Ma'aden Ijafen. Although Monod was not able to properly excavate on this brief expedition, and the site has yet to be relocated, he did, however, retrieve 25 of those brass rods, and lead isotope analysis reveals that the copper was not extracted from any of the suspected North African mines. Instead, the closest match is a seam of copper ore stretching across modern Belgium and the German Harz region. So although these are preliminary findings and there's a big push to reconsider this isotopic evidence, it seems that the brass ingots abandoned at Ma'aden Ijafen, though they never reached their final destination, had already come a long distance indeed. An initial report on the isotopic analysis of the copper alloy items from Derby Takashe states that the ingots found in Tumulus 5 similarly share isotopic ratios with a number of Western European ore deposits, also linking the burials on the Nigerian savannas to the mining centers of Northern Europe. Furthermore, while there is great diversity of isotopic ratios among the copper alloy objects from Derby Takashe, the man buried with the ingots cast his impressive anklets from his own stock of this same material. Ingots and anklets share the exact same composition and isotopic signature. This individual, for whom the brass trade was clearly important and whose identity it must have defined, fashioned them or had them fashioned for him from the materials of prestige trade items to accompany him to the grave. The local and the foreign, the elephant ivory around his wrists and the European copper around his ankles, both expressed his status and identity within his community. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Yoruba kingdom of Ife was flourishing in the forest zone of the Niger River Delta. Ibn Battuta seems to have known of Ife, describing it more or less correctly as the kingdom beyond the last territories of the Empire of Mali. Ife is known today for the astonishing group of naturalistic, lost wax cast copper alloy heads that were unearthed in the palace compound of the Oni, or ruler of Ife, in 1938. Rather than the compelling heads from the palace compound, however, it is the seated figure from Tada, a small Nupe trading village about 200 kilometers due north of Ife along the banks of the Niger River, that offers for us the perfect illustration of trade, exchange, and material desire. Dated to 1325 plus or minus 60 years, the Tada figure is thus contemporary with the burials at Derby Takashe, and not insignificantly with the apogee of Gothic ivory carving in Western Europe. Seated on the ground with one leg bent and the other foot tucked underneath, the 53.77 meter high sculpture displays remarkable attention to naturalistic detail of the figure's anatomy and physiognomy. Although unanimously attributed to the workshops of Ife due to stylistic and technical similarities, the seated figure was not found in the shrines or sites of Ife. Rather, it was removed in 1979 from a sacred hut at Tada and moved to the National Museum of Lagos. Isotopic analysis of the nearly pure copper from which the cedar figure was cast indicates that the ore came neither from a local Nigerian source nor a North African one. Instead, the copper ore seems to come from the Massif Central, a mineral-rich outcropping of the Earth's crust in southern France. The copper from which the Tada figure was cast may thus come from the very territories that so desired Savannah elephant ivory at exactly the same moment. Elephant tusks that were in turn carved into figures for Christian worship. For example, the Abbey of Frigolet, 70 kilometers or about 2 days' journey from the southern limits of the Massif Central, had, at the time of the French Revolution at least, an ivory Virgin and Child. Such large-scale ivory statuettes were frequently used in this period in liturgy and private devotion, and were the focus of pious veneration. These two communities, Frigolet and Tada, can therefore be posited as being in a mutually dependent chiastic relationship, each providing for the other raw materials for the production of ritually important figural sculpture. They can be seen materially and artistically as equal partners in an exceptionally long-distance intercontinental trade network. So part 3, Ivory's Louis IX and the Island of Gold. Gothic Europe's reliance on trade with the Sahara and the African savannas receives vanishingly little acknowledgement in contemporary European sources. But one of the loudest witnesses to Western Europe's profound connections with sub-Saharan Africa are the extant objects fashioned from African savanna ivory, such as this extraordinary group of statuettes made for the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, just outside of Paris. Gothic ivories bespeak their tangible association with a distant lobe of the world system when essential to its economic success. These statuettes themselves furnish evidence of the ties that bound Gothic France to sub-Saharan Africa and force us to envision Europe in its place as only part of a broader whole. The Saint-Denis group was commissioned sometime in the 1260s, and just a few years later, in the late 1260s, a second, even larger Ivory Virgin and Child was commissioned for the Sainte-Chapelle. That's two large, sumptuous works of ivory for the two most prestigious sites of Capetian royal fashioning. The celebrated Palatine Chapel we see here on the Ile de la Cité, and the burial place of French kings. Whoever thought to create these statuettes, celebrating the divinely ordained kingship of France, chose a material that was possible only thanks to involvement in the world system. But might there be more? Might we go further than mere exoticism or an appreciation of a particularly fine carving material? Can the fuller sense of the dynamics of contemporary Trans-Saharan politics illuminate these ivory masterpieces? The statuettes from Saint-Denis and the Sainte-Chapelle in the 1260s, exquisite and massive works in ivory, are coeval with two decisions by the royal household that historians continue to see as enigmatic. First, in 1266, Louis IX chose to mint the écu d'or and return the coinage of the French realm to the bimetallic standard. Historians in general have seen this monetary move as an ill-conceived failure, and Philippe le Hardi, Louis IX's son and successor, immediately canceled the coin in 1270. As foolish as it may seem, William Chester Jordan argued that the introduction of the écu d'or culminated a long period of monetary reforms extending back to Louis IX's First Crusade. In 1251, at Acre, Louis IX issued the Sarrazana, a gold coin used in the Latin kingdom, modeled upon the Muslim dinar. But Louis insisted on Christianizing its Arabic inscription. Jordan argues that Louis needed to wait 15 years to mint a gold coin at home because of the endemic shortages of gold bullion in continental Europe. However, the Italian city-states of Florence and Genoa did not lack access to gold at precisely this moment. Both began to mint gold coins in 1252, just a year after that Sarrazana. Hence, herein lies our important connection to trans-Saharan trade. Thomas Walker has demonstrated that it was privileged trading relations Florence and Genoa enjoyed with Hafsid-ruled Tunisia, the important outlet of trans-Saharan commerce to the Mediterranean in the 13th century, that enabled these Italian city-states to mint their own gold coinage. Trade connections with the Hafsids thus supplied Genoa and Florence with West African gold, a direct product of trans-Saharan trade. The other curiosity of Louis IX's late reign is his near-suicidal decision to return on crusade, a decision announced in 1267 against all counsel and just months after minting the écu d'or. Departing in 1270, the Crusaders did not head immediately for Jerusalem, nor for vulnerable Acre, the last Crusader-held city in the Levant, nor towards the powerful Mamluks situated in Egypt. Instead, they sailed for Hafsid, Tunis. After an initial success landing in the beginning of the siege of Tunis, the Frankish army contracted dysentery, and King Louis IX died soon after on African soil. The aftermath of the processions and the erection of the Montjoie marking the king's body's return to Paris are all well known to medievalists, but it is the reason behind the attack on Ifriqiya in the first place that remains quixotic to the historians. Louis IX's Dominican confessor, Geoffroy Boileau, in his biography written in the years after the king's death, that is, a hagiography, offered a pretext for the crusade to Tunis with the conversion of the Hafezid Emir, Muhammad al-Munstasir. While this seems in character with the saintly king, there are few other documents to reinforce this reading, although William Chester Jordan has recently pursued this logic. In contrast, writing about 100 years later, the Tunisian historian Ibn Khaldun, in his generally quite precise historical text of the Kitab al-Ibar, mentions similar embassies, but rather indicates that the subject of the envoys and treaties was far from the question of conversion and actually had to do with the much more prosaic fuel of worldly affairs, and that is money. According to Ibn Khaldun, who gives as his source well-connected family relations, the first embassy to Paris was not from the Hafizids themselves, but of representatives from the Frankish mercantile community at Tunis, who were owed money by a deceased Tunisian functionary, who owed 300,000 gold dinars. Apparently, these dissatisfied merchants also indicated that a recent famine and epidemic had weakened the defenses of the rich Hafezid kingdom, making it propitious for attack. When King Louis decided to do just this, the emir heard of his plans and, while reinforcing his country's defenses, sent an official embassy to Paris. After these preparations, the Sultan sent ambassadors to the King of the French to learn of his intentions and to propose favorable conditions that might end his warmongering ardor. It is said that the envoys brought with them 80,000 pieces of gold to reinforce the negotiations. The king apparently accepted the money, but let it be known that he would continue with the expedition nevertheless. When they, the ambassadors, requested that their money be returned, Louis pretended that he had not received the monies himself. It seems, at least according to Ibn Khaldun, that money, and more specifically gold bullion, contributed to Louis's decision to attack Hafezid Tunis. And while this interpretation flies in the face of the received image of a saintly Louis IX, we must remember that so many of our sources about the king's personality stem from hagiographic texts, and thus are hardly disinterested witnesses. We should open the door to imagining a much more complicated man. Therefore, given the context of the competition for access to gold bullion, I might propose that Louis IX directed his fleet to Tunis because he was interested in wresting access to Trans-Saharan trade goods, notably gold, but also alum, ivory, grains of paradise, and many other things. Louis IX's brother, Charles of Anjou, King of Sicily since 1266, perhaps an interesting correspondence in the year there, negotiated an extremely generous tribute from the Hafizids after he called off the Crusaders' siege, which included 110,000 pieces of gold, each piece worth 50 silver dirham, in addition to the arrears on the annual tribute to Sicily from the last 5 years, and that's probably another 60,000 pieces of gold. That all of these thousands of ounces of gold were explicitly associated with sub-Saharan Africa, trans-Saharan trade, and the so-called island of gold located in those territories can now be proven by 2 documents from the Angevin archives, sadly destroyed in the World War II. Contracted in the Crusader encampment before the ruins of Carthage, both documents discuss the loans of cash in the aftermath of Louis IX's death in September of 1270. Both documents use the term auro de paiola, or gold from Palolis, to describe the precious metal changing hands. The first 3,000 ounces which Charles of Anjou loaned from his recently crowned nephew Philippe de Hardy, and the second 2,000 ounces of gold which Charles loaned to his own brother Alfonso of Poitiers. The term auro de Pagliola has perplexed editors and scholars, and its significance has hitherto not been identified. Yet, since at least the classical Greek geographer Ptolemy, the term paiolas has identified for Westerners the gold-producing regions of sub-Saharan West Africa, the mythical island of gold. For example, Giovanni da Carigano of Genoa, on his early Portoland map, also destroyed in World War II, which probably dates to around 1320 or about 50 years after the events of the Eighth Crusade, labeled an island on the southeast region of the Niger River, the Insula Paola ubi aurum colligitur, the island of Paola where gold is collected. These two records of truly princely sons changing hands in the shadows of Carthage prove that the French elites, all princes and kings, identified the stunning gold riches obtained in Tunisia with Trans-Saharan trade in West Africa. While these documents do not prove that control of Trans-Saharan trade and thus the source of ivory and gold were the reason for launching the crusade, they do conclusively prove that the key players knew that the gold obtained in Tunisia was the riverine gold of West Africa. And if so, I would argue that the ivory statuettes installed at Saint-Denis and the Sainte-Chapelle take on a profound new meaning, a sort of aspirational colonialism. The prominent and remarkable ivory Virgin and Child statuettes displayed at churches of political importance exceeded their religious function. The significance of such works must be reimagined within their world system. The ivories at Saint-Denis and the Sainte-Chapelle, beyond their religious iconography, communicated loudly privileged access to Trans-Saharan goods, just as the Écus d'Or purported to do. An aspiration to control the auro de paiola, bullion from the island of gold, and therefore the ivories should be seen within the proto-colonial expansionist policies typical of the late 13th century and a harbinger of the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I think it's just, it's so important to hear talks like this, and I feel like when we shift our viewpoint, yes, it gives us a broader perspective, and that in a general sense, of course, is valuable. But it's just amazing to me how, by shifting our geographical viewpoint, you really enable us to then shift our interpretation, right? So that objects like these ivories, or even people like Louis IX, that for medievalists anyways, they're just so familiar seeming, and yet this little shift of how we think about them can really add whole new layers of meaning to our understanding of them. So thank you very much for this talk today. We do have a couple of questions coming in, and of course, people can continue to ask questions. So let me pose one of those questions first. And I do want to just say I have asked students from one of my classes to attend this talk, and so far 2 of the questions are from my students. So thanks, students. Okay. So the first question has to do with the burials at Derby Takushei, and specifically at Tumulus 5, as they relate to the question of how the tomb's resident had used these objects in a kind of a way to sort of establish their identity or self-fashioning. And so the question is, in addition to the chemical analysis that allow these objects to be connected to Northern European in terms of their materials, is there any evidence of global exchange in the forms of artistic processes or stylistic preferences? So is there more evidence in the shapes of these objects or their appearance or how they were made that can kind of bolster those connections?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think it's really quite interesting. The tombs of Derby Takushei are fascinating, and the kind of just beginning to open up everything that they have to tell us. And one of the periods that they cover, going from probably the early 14th century to probably the early 15th century, is a period of increasing importation of finished objects. And I'm thinking specifically of bronze and brasswork. And so there is like an inlaid Ayyubid Mamluk basin in which all of those ivory bangles were buried. So there's definitely a taste for imported goods. At this period, I would say that especially things like those anklets are very much arising from a local endogenous style, an endogenous object type. Anklets are a very frequent type of jewelry that is used across, or jewelry, regalia perhaps, that's used across West Africa. So one of the things that I think is really quite fascinating is the marriage between local object types, local styles, with imported materials, because of course that's what's happening in Western Europe as well. And so I really like thinking about that, the tension between the two, and how there is, specifically in West Africa at this period, that there is this need and desire for material that surpasses locally available resources. And so studies of other sites such as Igbo-Ukwu, which is probably an 8th, 9th century site, which has over 600 pieces of lost wax cast bronze that has emerged from a couple of different excavations, more emergency excavations. That the isotopic analysis on the Igbo-Ukwu has shown us that there is a prevalence of locally available copper from the rift along the Benue River. And so this earlier material in early centuries, when Trans-Saharan, the Islamic Trans-Saharan trade was in its sort of first steps, it was just getting started and was increasing in importance. That the materials of this incredible bronze casting industry was really based on local materials. And then later, there is a sort of a call, a desire that kind of draws in raw material from farther and farther afield. So I think that that's always interesting, the marriage between the local and the international, and those incredible anklets are one of the most beautiful examples, and especially that he was buried with both the finished object around his ankles and the ingots. That really completely makes clear the connection between those objects.
Yes, thank you. So, another couple of questions that have come in, they're related, I think, so I'm going to combine them. And in a sense, they're kind of the inverse of that question. And that is about the awareness and response to these trade networks on the European side. Were there, in addition to the materials, were there people coming from Africa that were bringing techniques or were bringing stylistic or other kinds of ideas around art with them to Europe? And did awareness of these trade networks, did that shift or impact Europeans' views of Africa at all? Is that something are there traces of that in the records?
There's the question of the enslavement of people and the involvement of enslaved people in the Muslim, especially in the Muslim world in terms of slavery, is a topic of great interest. I think when I was thinking through this talk again, I should make clear the point that also slaves seem to have been taken in both directions across the Sahara, not just out of Africa, but also in. Everyone, slavery in the Muslim world was an equal opportunity institution. Everyone could be enslaved at various points. And so it was profoundly different than the way the transatlantic trade functioned in the early modern world system. So that's an important distinction to be made. So people certainly moved, not just the merchants, travelers and scholars, individuals who were going on their, Muslim individuals who were going on their Hajj, who were going to Mecca and Medina for religious pilgrimage. You know, we have lots of stories of people traveling for a whole variety of different reasons. And all of this I'm answering because we don't have a lot of information about artisans traveling. There are a couple of later recorded oral histories that talk about, for example, an architect that comes from Iberia to the Empire of Mali, who brings a new building style. But that is pretty a story that is not embraced by the scholars of West African Muslim architecture now. It seems rather, yes, that there was a building boom, but rather they're very fundamentally grounded in indigenous building styles. And so I would say that the same goes for things, again, like the bronze casting, that even if the material is coming in from farther away, that really we can see with relatively fine detail now, the development of indigenous bronze casting techniques. And so there is not really a need for, and one of the things that I really like are kind of innovative solutions and kind of problem solving that has a sort of a different pathway than what is taken in either the Mediterranean world or in Western Europe. So the questions of techniques, I think, still remains to be investigated further. I've been looking into gold work recently because why not? It's gorgeous, and I'm an art historian who likes pretty things. And it seems, looking at gold working techniques, jewelry making techniques, seems to tell a slightly different story. Possibly that's because more objects because they're smaller, traveled in both directions. But I think there's also the possibility that there were craftsmen, perhaps because they were elite craftsmen who worked for courts, that they would be brought in. And so I think that this is one of the topics that still really calls for more investigation, but that in every case we need to kind of carefully balance the richness of the indigenous styles and techniques against what is coming in from abroad, because so much of the historiography in historic West Africa has been to always explain away any innovation or fabulously sophisticated techniques as something being imported. And I think for obvious reasons that we need to really gird ourselves against such approaches in our scholarship in the 21st century.
So I am being mindful of the time. I want to give Anne Goodyear a chance to wrap things up, and again to thank you. And but I just want to acknowledge there is another question in the queue that we're not going to have time for, but I think the point of the question is a really important one, which is just to say that your work really makes very clear, really demonstrates well how the boundaries that have been put in our discipline of art history have been real limitations to us, that we focus on specific nations or specific regions, and you might even say specific time periods, and that this kind of work really helps to show us that we need to shake that up and change that. So, so thank you for that, for implying that, and also thank you for what you more explicitly stated in the talk. It's really been a pleasure to hear you speak and to engage with these ideas. And so thank you again for coming. And I want to, again, we're not quite done, but I do want to thank our audience also for joining us today. And then I'm going to turn things back over to Ann Collins-Goodyear. Ann?
Well, Sarah and Kate, thank you both for first, Sarah, an extraordinary presentation, and Kate, thank you so much for doing such a great job moderating a very lively discussion that, as you indicated, leaves us with a lot of ongoing food for thought. And Sarah, as your talk demonstrates, new views of the Middle Ages and the Wyvern collection more broadly provide fascinating insights into what we must now recognize as the global Middle Ages. For audience members with young families, we want to let you know that our upcoming virtual Family Day program, which will debut this coming Saturday, March 6th at 10 a.m., will be dedicated to new views of the Middle Ages and will be run by Elizabeth Humphrey, curatorial assistant and manager of student programs. We also urge you to join us again in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, at 1 p.m. for a discussion of another BCMA exhibition that benefits significantly from the Wyvern collection on the presence of the past, art from Central and West Africa. Curators Alison Martino, Raymond and Laura Wilgu, curator of the art of Africa, Oceania, and the indigenous art of the Americas at the Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University, Bloomington, and David Gordon, professor of art history at Bowdoin College, will discuss how On the Presence of the Past provides new ways to understand Central and West African art through its juxtaposition of historic objects produced during the past century to explore ideas of power, gender, and cultural appropriation. And like new views of the Middle Ages, On the Presence of the Past is available through a virtual version on our website. So please take advantage of the opportunity to check that out. And more information about both these programs, the presentation on the 17th by Alison Martino and David Gordon, as well as our upcoming Family Saturday program this coming Saturday, are available on our website. So we hope to see you again online on March 10th and on March 17th. Thank you again for being with us today. And Sarah Guérin, thank you again for an absolutely fascinating presentation. Your observations, I think, will long be with us as we continue to enjoy new views of the Middle Ages, for which we thank Kate Ivory and her students. So thank you to all, and look forward, I hope, to seeing each of you soon.